It's now my pleasure to introduce Paul Gale-Baker, who will be running our Wicking Bed Workshop this evening. Paul is a co-founder of Sustainable Macleod and the immediate past president. In another life, before retirement, Paul ran a small business called Urban Shepherd, in which he built dozens of workshops for clients. He was also called in by a lot of other people who had built their own or had their wicking beds built for them to troubleshoot problems that they had been unable to solve, or that their wicking bed was not operating successfully. And Paul was always able to remedy these situations. So without more ado, I will pass you over to Paul to share his expertise with you. Paul.
Thanks very much for that introduction, Robin. Can people hear me okay at the moment? Good, thank you very much. I'm going to share the screen and jump fairly quickly into the Wicking Bed Workshop. I am anticipating there'll be questions at the end, and maybe that'll be almost the bulk of the presentation. But please do hold your questions until then, and I will answer all that I can. If I can't answer them all tonight, I'm very happy to answer them over email. So sharing screen. And starting off the slideshow. So the first bit is fairly self-explanatory, but we're going to do a little bit of Wicking Beds 101 just to get the really simple basics of wicking beds down. Now, I know that a lot of people this evening will be very aware of how wicking beds work, but I do want to just cover the basics very simply. So a wicking bed starts with a concept of a pond of water. That's what's at the bottom of it, so to speak. So that pond of water is usually contained in either timber or galvanized iron, occasionally inside the plastic IBCs, those tanks that you see around the place. And we can talk about that a little bit later on. So into the wicking bed goes scoria or sand. Sand and flow tanks, which I'll explain later, are my preferred method, but either scoria or sand and flow tanks are going to fill that pond up. On top of that is a layer of geotextile, and that separates the growing medium, the soil, from the pond. So you add an outlet and an inlet, and there you've got your wicking bed. So very simple in concept. The execution, though, I think you'll find is another thing. So there's a wicking bed that I supervised. There were actually two that used to be on the platform at Eltham Station. So Local Food Connect organised for that to happen. And that was actually very successful. As you can see, that one also has the addition of a plinth on top. Most of the ones that I've built, like these three here in Macleod, are not with plinths, and we can talk about the pros and cons of that a little bit later. So the obvious question is, why on earth would we want to have a wicking bed? Yep, it is all about the water. That's the bottom line. That's the absolute reason for having one. So if you look at a standard raised garden bed, and most of us, will grow in some form of raised bed, maybe not quite that high, it might be a little bit lower, but what we'll be needing to do with a bed like that is to either overhead water or to water with drip line. But the problem is that plants need water at the root zone. I can't stress that enough. The absolute power of wicking beds is to provide water right at the root zone. So apart from a wicking bed, the most effective way of watering is with drip line. So that's a picture from the community garden. As you can see with that blue triangle, what happens there is that each drip out of that water line, out of that drip line, will spread in a cone shape underneath the soil. So it is a far more effective than overhead watering, which often, if it's done badly or without thought, will actually not water the roots at all. So wicking beds, though, are even more effective. They supply water exactly where the plants need it, at the roots. So there's a basic wicking bed, and I'll explain the different parts of it. First of all, you've got your container. So that brown outline there, and unfortunately I can't use a pointer on this, but the brown outline there is either a galvanized iron, probably, or a timber bed. Next to that, the blue pond liner, that dark blue color is the pond liner. And I stress pond liner because a lot of people use builder's plastic, that black plastic that you can buy at Bunnings or your favorite hardware store. However, builder's plastic is not designed to hold water. And so many wicking beds have come to grief because people have chosen black plastic thinking that it's, well, you know, it looks waterproof. Unfortunately, it's too fragile. It's likely to be pierced the moment you try to put it inside a wicking bed. And the sad outcome is that if you've built the whole wicking bed and you've got a pond liner or builder's plastic with a hole in, then you've got a leaking bed, not a wicking bed. And that's the most miserable outcome you can possibly have. So apart from that, you'll see that there's a base of scoria in this one. There's a water overflow at the top, and I'll explain why I've put it at the top of the scoria later. There's a water inlet and the water outlet. Now, geotextile is that fabric which separates the soil from the pond. So very crucial, very important to keep the soil that you're growing in separate from the pond, okay? All kinds of troubles can happen. You can get stinky ponds and all the rest of it. Now, some people try using various sorts of weed mat. They are certainly cheaper, but they are not effective. What's going to likely happen is you'll have material go through it. They are simply not good enough. So a proper geotextile, and Bulleen Art and Garden, for example, are one of the places that sells it. Good geotextile, proper geotextile, is actually polypropylene that has been pierced, as opposed to a woven or otherwise constructed weed mat. So please don't use weed mat. So scoria is the material used here, and that's what some of my early wicking beds looked like with the scoria going into the pond. You can see the black liner, so that's a proper pond liner. That will hold water, and it's tough, so far tougher than builder's plastic. You can also use, you can also use gravel. That's a wicking bed construction. We did several more. We did another 2, I think it was. It was a total of, I think it was a total of 8. That was at Diamond Creek Primary School. And they're terrific. They actually won an award for their garden design, some of which I worked with them on. But I supervised the construction of the wicking beds. You'll notice also that they are galvanized iron. Now, it wasn't my choice to have gravel, and that's perfectly okay. They chose gravel. But for my money, scoria would have been a slightly preferable method. The reason being that you can see the gravel there, and I'll go back to the scoria. You can see how large the scoria stones are compared to the gravel. And of course, the larger the pieces, such as the scoria, the more space you've got in there where water's going to be held. And if you're wanting the wicking bed to last for a period of time before you top it up, then having good space in there is critical, space for the water to fill, in other words. My preferred method is flow tanks and sand. So flow tanks are a proprietary product. They're produced by Atlantis, that's the company. They're possible to get at least one place, and that's a store, the G store. That's just the letter G dash store, and that's on the Princes Highway, not too far from Chadstone. They handle commercial kinds of installations. So flow tanks and sand. What you can see there is all the identical setup to the previous wicking bed, except the scoria has been replaced by the sand and the flow tanks. Now, I came across this idea looking at one of Costa's videos from his early days as Costa's Garden Odyssey, and he used a similar construction to that with the flow tanks and sand. And I found out later talking to him that the reason he uses them is because he used to be employed by Atlantis. He used to use these materials over in Austria, is my understanding, where he did a lot of water-related constructions, and he just thought they were a terrific thing to use, and so do I. Now, there's a very good reason why I like them so much. The sand is fine, of course. It's even finer, in fact, than the gravel that you saw, but the flow tanks are wrapped in a geotextile, and I'll show you pictures of it in a moment. They're wrapped in a geotextile so the sand can't get into the flow tank, but water can. So each of those blocks is a block of water. So depending on how many flow tanks you were to put into a wicking bed, you can have a lot of water sitting in there. Now, the interesting thing about sand is that it does wick. Far better than gravel and way, way better than scoria. So if you go to the beach and you puddle around with sand that's near the waterline, you'll notice that moisture rises. And these flow tanks, this flow tank and sand construction is has the sand 50 millimeters sitting on top of the flow tanks, 50 millimeters, and then there's the geotextile on top of that and the soil. Now, what happens is that the soil in the wicking bed has a lovely flat surface connection with the sand, and the sand stays moist. It stays moist even when the level drops. Sand is very effective at wicking, and that's of course what these things are called. They're called wicking beds. And wicking, of course, is that motion of the water upwards against gravity, in fact. You know, you'll notice it with a candle. So a candle wick, I understand, takes the whatever the combustible substance is in the candle, and it goes up through the wick. But here, what's happening is that the water is actually moving upwards to the root zone. Okay, so there's just a very simple construction. You can see the water inlet there just placed inside the flow tank. You can see we've started to put the sand around the flow tanks, and you can see they're wrapped in the geotextile, which will also separate the soil from the sand. Again, the sand sits 50 millimeters or as close as possible to above the top of the flow tanks. So thinking about the reasons we might choose a wicking bed, and I am going to come back to the construction in a moment, but I want to think about for a moment why on earth we'd go to the trouble of building something like this. And it's not a small enterprise. If you want to build a wicking bed, and I've built somewhere around 40 to 50 and helped with a whole lot of others, if you want to build one, it will take work. And the thing that you want to do is get it right. You want to do it once and do it properly. So reasons for choosing wicking beds. Now, this is the second wicking bed I ever built. And you might get an idea that there's a fair bit of produce. That's a pretty productive, roughly 1.2 metres by 1.2 metres. And somebody on the call, I'm sure Peter can do the maths on the square, what that is in square metres. But a crude water inlet and a slightly crude outlet, but you can see how productive that is. There's a lot of produce in there. more importantly, sorry, not more importantly, but as importantly, you can turn the produce over quickly. And this is one of my favourite things to talk about, and that is I would always prefer to use wicking beds for annual produce. In other words, produce that you're going to grow, harvest in an ongoing cycle. Some people will love to have things like herbs that are perennials in there, and that's fine. That's a personal preference. But my feeling is that when something takes as much work and possibly as much money as it takes to put these together, I would prefer to have an ongoing, highly productive annual crop. That's a personal preference, and all of the opinions in this talk are my own. So there's another idea of how lush things can be in a wicking bed. And with that one, the client who wanted that wanted metal sides so that the rats wouldn't run up the wood. Now, the quality of the produce when you're working really well with a wicking bed is outstanding. That was the first root crop we grew in that bed that you saw earlier that had the Asian greens. So brilliant produce without a lot of effort. All right, so let's look at putting it together now. For some of you, well, actually, I think almost everybody on this call, this is a bit of history in how sustainable Macleod developed over time. You can see there that the level scoria of the original tennis courts has been smoothed over. You can see in the background just the beginnings of our orchard. The plants aren't even in there, just the soil. You can see the construction. It's a very basic box construction. The material used is macrocarpa or golden cypress. Now, the nice thing about that is that it is resistant to, generally speaking, to weather and to other things that happen in the soil. The only downside at the moment is that because it's become so popular, we think that the golden cypress that's coming in now is younger and doesn't necessarily have all the qualities of the original, much more mature golden cypress. So we are noticing that some of them don't last as long. But there's the box. Next thing is a layer of sand which protects the pond liner that we're going to place on top. So we need to protect our pond liner, and I can't stress that nearly enough. The pond liner has to work. The smallest hole in a pond liner is going to give you grief. And let me assure you, as someone who's pulled apart other wicking beds, almost all except one, I think, was not my own, and I only had to undo those so we could move things around in the garden. But undoing a wicking bed is a horrible process. It's really disheartening, and it's messy as all get out. So a layer of sand on the bottom, that's going to protect the bottom of the pond liner from any sharp stones or anything like that. And sand is lovely because it just sits there. So that's a scoria bed. I've put the water in there already, 2 scoria beds, in fact. Pond liner you can see in one. In the one behind, you can see I've used a white geotextile, and that's the kind that Bulleen Art and Garden has. So there's the top of the pond in a wicking bed. Now, one of the things to notice, if you are going to use scoria, and that's quite reasonable, most people do use scoria. If you decide to use that, make sure that the water level is just below a reasonable number of the scoria stones. So you can see there that some of those stones are sitting above the water level. That's where I would leave it, and that's where I would set my water level. And the water level, of course, is going to be set by where you set your outflow. So what's going to happen is the geotextile sits on top of that, and the geotextile doesn't sit in a puddle of water. water is touching it, but mostly it's moisture. So we don't want it to get too wet. We don't want the bottom of our growing medium to get too wet. We want it moist, not necessarily wet. Now, some wicking beds have outlets at the bottom. And if you choose one of the galvanised iron beds at places like Bulleen Art and Garden, they will usually be set up to have a bottom outlet. Now, the reason that people who build wicking beds say they want the bottom outlet is that they're worried that the pond will get stinky, that it will go what we call anaerobic. Now, I can say over all those wicking beds that I've built, I have never had one become anaerobic. It has never been an issue. First of all, you can flush them out if you have to, but even letting the water level drop means that air is going to be sucked into the pond. So it's hard for it to become anaerobic, and it's never happened in my experience. So for this one, which was a very early wicking bed I did what everybody else did and figured out a way to have the water outlet at the bottom, but the water level is at the top of that little collection of plumbing that I've put there. So where the top hole is in that thing that looks a bit like a periscope, that's where the water level is inside the pond. So that was fine, it worked, but here's the kicker. If you have a bottom outlet like that, and there are many variations that do exactly the same thing, they have a bottom outlet and an extension that takes the water level up higher. If you, for some reason, don't quite seal it well enough, again, you've got a leaking bed. And my preference has always been, and time has borne out the wisdom of this, I would much prefer that the water outlet is at the level that I want the water to be. So again, there's another early couple. Now, this is how I do it these days. You can see where the water level is. It's right at the bottom of that water outlet. So above that's the soil, below that's the water, and that's where I like to put it. If I don't seal it absolutely 100%, the very worst that's going to happen is I'll get a tiny little lowering of the water level, but it will only go down to the level wherever I didn't seal it properly, which won't be catastrophic. Annoying, perhaps, but not catastrophic. So here's the construction using flow tanks. You can see I've used 4. I should just say the size is pretty standard. It's 2.4 metre sleepers and half that across the width. So, using sleepers just makes sense to do at those proportions. It works as a good set of proportions. 2.4 by 1.2 metres means that you can reach in easily. There's quite a decent sort of space of growing medium, and they work well. These ones I put 4 in. So there are 4 blocks of water. I know how much water is going to be in that when it's full. This is back on Eltham Station with the 2 that we built there. And here's the wrapping of the flow tank. So that's a flow tank. It comes, and I should go back before, that stack of black lattice type stuff on the end of that wicking bed, that's what that becomes. It clips together, just slots together very simply, and forms a very rigid, very strong construction. You can stand on it. In fact, they use these things, usually the larger versions of these, in large underground water retaining ponds, and they're strong enough to drive trucks over. So they're pretty solid. Polypropylene again, and they're being wrapped with a polypropylene pond liner. So adding the sand, the more hands you've got, the quicker it goes in. And you can see we had a few to do if you check out the piles of sand and soil behind. Notice that I'm keeping the pond liner there in place with clamps. Anything to avoid being messy about things is a good idea. So the geotextile has gone over the top. In this case, it's the black geotextile. And I've carefully, or we have carefully made sure that the water inlet that's right at the back of that pond is sealed. So soil can't get around that and down into the pond. And you can see already that the outlet is dripping slightly. So we've already fired it up full of water, and we're placing the geotextile. So in this case, the soil is veggie mix, which is pretty standard. I would suggest that you talk to your nursery people, if it's preferably Bulleen Art and Garden. They're very good to talk to. Ask them what's in the mix. Check that there's nothing that's too much like fresh manure. As you can see, that's one of the very first wicking beds. I think it's the second, in fact. And you can see in the background that the orchard, the community garden, so young, the orchard is still not fitted out with plants. And there's the very happy group, having performed the task of building 3 of those wicking beds in one day. Fantastic. So when you do put the soil in, make sure you heap it, because it'll settle. And again, just to highlight the reason we're doing this, there's abundance. Now, wicking beds do come in a variety of shapes and sizes, from small courtyard wicking beds, which I did for somebody living in a unit, right through to more dramatic constructions. And in this case, you'll see that the 4 wicking beds towards the back there, or the side, if you like, they actually are an irregular shape. Yes, it took me some time to work out how to fit those all together, but they did, and last reports were they were going fine, and that's quite some years back now. The client wanted a space inside the wicking beds there to put a table or a chair or something like that, but that allowed for that. So that was fun to design and put together. In this one, I've used plinths, and we'll be seeing in a moment why a plinth can be such a good idea. So the obvious thing is it protects the top of the wood, and I'll show you a little bit about why that matters. So galvanised iron, that's my preference. In fact, all of our wicking beds here at home now are galvanised iron. I've done a few innovations. The key one, if you look around the top lip of the wicking bed, it's what I've got there is holding the geotextile in place, and that's what we call pinch weld. Now, pinch weld is that metal, rubber-covered metal that goes around door frames of cars. Clark Rubber sell it in various sizes, and I'd looked around for best part of a year or more to find something that would sit on top, look reasonably attractive, and hold the geotextile in place, because of course with the galvanised iron bed you can't staple it to the side like I used to. You can't, apart from draping it over. But with the pinch weld, I was able to have a much neater top. So just a little thing. Also to notice that with galvanised iron, because you can't fit hoops to the side, just done a very basic use of 2 different size of electrical. Is the hoop. The white hoop part is an electrical conduit. The bit in the ground is your standard plumbing pipe. That was the very first wicking bed I built, and I'm sorry about the quality of the photo, but did that in a fruit crate because that's what you did. I'd heard that wicking beds was worth doing. Notice also I've used builder's plastic, and you'll notice a little bit about the fruit crate, and I'll show you in a moment a more dramatic, well, not more dramatic, but a clearer picture perhaps of why I don't use fruit crates. They used to be very popular, but if you look at what's happening in the corner, you'll see that the timber is pulling away from the support. Now, the trouble with fruit crates is they're not made of weather safe material. They're just a basic hardwood. In fact, I think the corner pieces are not even hardwood. And what happens, because most of them are nailed with standard iron nails, is they pull apart. So they're not reliable as a construction. So here we are in the community garden several years on. Because they're timber, we've been able to put the hoops over the top, put protective netting over, but they're terrifically effective. And as you can see, and this photo is by now, I would say, getting nearly to the 10 years in the community garden, very close, in fact, to the 10 years. You can see that we're still producing a great deal of produce. We are adding to the soil, but I'll talk about that a little bit later. And there's another shot of galvanized iron wicking bed. This one differs from the previous one you saw. This was one that I got through Bulleen, and what it has is it has already sealed in the bottom a metal base. So as it comes, all of the galvanized iron, base and sides, make it an already waterproof, water-retaining bed. So the good thing about it is you don't have to add pond liner, and good pond liner costs a lot. It can cost around $300 just for a standard bed, and probably a little bit more these days. So being able to do away with the pond liner is terrific. It also means doing away with another source of plastic, because it is a form of plastic, even though it's a thing called EPDM, and I cannot remember the long technical name for that, but EPDM is the gold standard. It's essentially synthetic rubber. Now, this is a shot I took a little while ago. In fact, it was just about 2 or 3 weeks ago at another place. And what they've used there again is the crate, and you can see that it's coming apart. So over time, that'll get frustrating. Also, too, because you've got timber with the end grain up, it's more susceptible to weathering. So when you place wood vertical to the weather, if that makes sense, it's easier for moisture to enter the grain of the wood and start to rot things out. So here are my top tips, and we're nearly through the presentation part of this. Here are my top tips. First of all, make sure you don't pierce the geotextile. If you pierce the geotextile, soil is going to end up in the pond, and that's not a good thing. Oh my goodness, a spelling mistake, and I triple checked this. Topwater seedlings until they're established. They will do fine once they've got enough root growth, but make sure you do water them before they've got that. Now, especially do not over-fertilise. I would only ever apply good composted material, perhaps with the addition of some foliar spray, but no fresh manures, because a lot of that stuff is just going to leak down into the pond. So what we're attempting to do is to keep all the good stuff up in the soil, and have the pond as clean as we can. I'd also suggest you add a light mulch, obviously, on top. Sugarcane mulch is ideal. It's a bit hard to get other mulches to sit nicely, because of course you're going to have a fairly dense crop if you're doing this right. And what I'd suggest again is you plant seedlings closer together than recommended on the seed packet, because a wicking bed can take it. So a wicking bed really is like turbo, I hate terms like this, but it is like essentially like turbocharging your growth. And it does seem, and I've seen this time and time again, that the presence of available water, exactly what the plants require, far outweighs things like adding fertilizers and so on. I'm not saying you shouldn't fertilize, but you can hold right back on the fertilizing that we otherwise do. That having the water available seems to be the absolute answer. Now, I think it's about time to throw it over to you, and I'll go away from sharing the screen. And there we should be back together.
So have we a question for Paul?
Yes,
Carol,
yes, Carol.
could you unmute yourself?
There we go.
Hi, Carol.
My turn?
Yes.
Indeed.
Okay. Thank you. First of all, thank you for that. Very clear presentation. My problem is I've got wicking beds. I've actually got veg pods, which are wicking beds on feet, really, on a stand. Now, my problem is that I've left my pods unattended for over a year.
Mm.
And prior to that, because ill health, etc., and prior to that, they weren't getting a lot of good attention. So my concern is, what's the best way to reinvigorate them? Do I need to take all the dirt out? Do I need to, what should I be adding to bring them back to life?
Sure. And look, by the way, a shout out to Veggie Pods. That they're really useful for people who don't have time or the interest in building a wicking bed, and they do the same job. In fact, if you ever get the chance to go down to Cape Patterson, the Cape development, which is a housing development of highly sustainable houses, they have not only a community garden using Veggie Pods, but they have a complete urban farm, all situated in Veggie Pods. Look, the question is, what do you think might be the problem with the Veggie Pods? Do you think the soil is a bit exhausted? When you look at it, does it feel lively or?
I don't know. It was just instinct. I thought, I haven't touched this bed for a year. There's a few weeds and things in it. And before that year, I think the veggies weren't growing brilliantly anyhow. So I obviously needed to feed it with something. And so the starting point, if you like, was not a happy one for the plants, yes. And then a year of neglect.
Yeah. Look, I think I would, I'd get a sense of the soil structure. Now, one of the things you can do, of course, is to stick a bit of the soil in a jar and throw some water in, and just notice what settles in the different layers. Give it a shake. Notice what settles. Now, if you've got a reasonable amount of organic material in there, then you might have something to work with. Okay? But I would certainly add more material, and probably the simplest thing to do is to get some more veggie mix, checking what's in it. Now, in the veggie mix, if they say there's any zoo grow in there, or as we call it, as we know, it's zoo poo, I'd probably hold off a bit. A lot of that can be relatively uncomposted. It's often it often seems to be quite fresh manure. So I'd check what sort of manures, and I'd ask them if they don't have a veggie mix like that, if they can suggest a mix of soil and some sort of composted material that's not quite so powerful as that might be. But yeah, I would certainly add some. Replace it if there's no organic matter in the soil that you've got in your jar. I'd give that a miss personally, and I'd just replace the lot.
Right. Okay. So if there's no,
I mean, even though you've got mineral, you've got one part of the soil, you don't have the organic matter, and it suggests it's probably too exhausted to really bother with. But
so you just dig that out and throw it.
Yeah, well, I would, yeah. onto your garden, maybe.
Yes.
Or your compost heap. If you have a compost heap going, you could add that slowly to it.
So is there another question for Paul?
Thank you very much, Paul.
You're very welcome. Priya.
Hello. My question was, I liked the, sorry, this is my dog as well. I liked the galvanized iron ones with the hoops over the top for the netting. But how do you secure the netting to the galvanized iron? Or does it have to go all the way down to the ground? How do you actually clip it so that you don't have to have masses of netting going all the way down to the ground, you know? How do you do that?
Clips is a good way.
Clips.
You can buy packets of cheap clips of all kinds of sizes, from big ones to that sort of size, at one of your favourite hardware stores. They're relatively cheap. They're plastic, yes, I know, but then so's a lot of what we're using, and I'll talk about that in a minute because I think it's worth a bit of a discussion. Look, I would use clips. Simple as that, or
Easy.
down around the bottom bricks, anything which will anchor it. But clips sort of hold it reasonably well. You can do clips around the edge. You can do clips on the hoops themselves. They work fine.
Okay. Thanks, Paul.
Anyone else have a question? Pia.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've got a bunch. Hi, I've got a bunch of questions.
Oh, great.
Firstly on the clips thing, Priya, you can get these stainless steel
Clothes pegs.
clothes pegs that they cost more, but they just last forever.
Yes.
Right.
And they're really good.
Yeah, I've got.
Anyway,
Yes.
yeah, I love them using the kitchen and the garden. My first question was about the pinch weld that across the top. How do you do that?
Well, it's a U shape in section. If you cut through it, it's a U shape. So it just sits over the top of the galvanized iron. You just bang it with a mallet. It goes on very simply. It's exactly what they do with cars. So the cars have a metal lip, and they put the pinch weld over and just bang.
I see. And so that's a product that you can buy.
It's a product you can buy. You can buy it at Clark's Rubber. It's not super cheap, but it's not hideously expensive. So that's one option.
Okay, cool. My second question was, I don't have wicking beds anymore, but in the past I had a whole bunch of them in my last house, and I was always worried about the soil health if I wasn't watering from above. Yep. So obviously when they're little seedlings, as you talked about, you need to water them from above, but after a while you don't, because they're big enough and they're getting the water from below. But the soil at the top, I just kept worrying about the health of it. I'm just wondering what your experience of that is.
If you have a decent layer of mulch, it ought not to be too much of a problem. But look, if you're concerned, then do a little top watering. You're not from top watering because you've got a wicking bed.
Yeah.
And the thing to do, like what I say, is talk to the soil. Like, what does the soil tell you? Does the soil tell you I'm starting to dry out on top? Yeah, the plants are fine, but the soil on top's dry. If it's telling you that, then add some.
Yeah, okay.
But mulch.
Okay.
Mulch,
yeah, of course, yeah. And my next question is kind of related in the management of water, in that I was also never sure whether to let the water drop, how far to let the water drop before I refilled, or whether to keep it up at that top level as much as possible. And I guess it depends, but I'm just wondering about any advice on that.
Yeah. So then again, it's going to depend a lot on the weather and a lot on what time you've got to top up. but there's nothing wrong with topping it up quite regularly.
Okay.
You can in a good wicking bed. Now, one of the reasons I use flow tanks and sand is you need to top them up far less frequently because they'll still operate with the water at a relatively low level. They are very efficient. They're more time consuming to build, a little bit more, and just a touch more costly. The flow tanks are not particularly expensive. But if you're going to the trouble of making a wicking bed, it's worth at least thinking about that method. And they will continue to provide water, with quite a low level of water. We tend to just keep them topped up as a routine thing, because you're going to use the same amount of water.
Yes.
Whether you let it drop or whether you keep topping it up. I mean, it's,
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I have to say the flow tanks look brilliant.
They're great.
Yeah, that and sand. It seems like, and not only something that looks like it works really well, but also to make them would be a lot easier than all that gravel.
Well, you're shoveling less material. And I hate shoveling scoria. It's messy stuff. It's difficult to get a spade into the scoria, and believe me, I've done a lot.
Yeah.
So if I've got a preference, it's not for that. Sand is heavier but easier to shift.
Yes.
I know where my preference is.
Yeah.
So we have, let me see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 wicking galvanized iron wicking beds at home. Sorry, 6, excuse me. And they're all flow tanks and sand.
Yeah, great. And my last question was just that you mentioned that you prefer corrugated iron over timber now, and I'm just wondering what all of the reasons for that might be.
So one is the problem I mentioned with macrocarpa, that these days it's no longer as stable as it used to be. You can get around that. I know one person who had red gum sleepers as their wicking bed. So that's lasting a lot better, I gather. But that's fairly expensive, and we don't necessarily want to cut red gum these days. So galvanized iron is lightweight. We can go back and forward about whether it uses more energy than cutting timber. There's so many arguments around wicking beds and discussions. But nowadays, with reliable bases in them, in other words, you're essentially buying a tank. So the old tanks that people used to use and probably still use to feed water into their country homes, that's what that is, essentially. Same good old technology. It means you don't have to buy what could be up to $300 worth of pond liner. And generally speaking, it's a while since I've purchased one, but a reasonable size one of those is going to cost you about the same for the whole galvanized tank as a pond liner would.
Yeah, right. Okay.
I like it. Also, too, yes, like my client who wanted some galvanized iron on the side of the bed, rats find it harder to run up.
Yes.
Probably not impossible,
yes. And
rats, but harder.
Yeah. Okay, that's interesting. Thank you so much. That was a really clear presentation.
Very well.
It was very nice.
Paul, I wonder if you could comment on galvanized beds which come with the outlet at the bottom.
Good point.
And how you can get the outlet at the top.
Sure. So if you just ask somewhere like Bulleen Art and Garden to provide you with that, you'll get a tank garden bed with a base in it. There'll be a hole in it drilled already, and unfortunately that hole is almost certainly going to be at the bottom. Now, if you're willing to take the risk and believe that you can actually seal it up, then good luck. But it's not something I would do. So when I get them from Bulleen or wherever, Bulleen's where all of these have come from, I've always said make sure they don't put a hole in it, because I want to drill the hole myself. So what I use is a hole saw. So that's a bit that goes on a drill, that
Yeah.
has a round piece that just dives in. Now it makes a hell of a noise, but it's not for very long because steel is thin. But make
Yeah.
sure you know how to set it up, and if you want instructions about how to place it on tanks, the tanks have got corrugations, so you're going to have to figure out where you place it, and it would take too long now to go through all of that. And what you can see is we use, oh no, I can't see on that photo. Sorry, I was going to show you a photo of a tank fitting, but a tank fitting outlet is what there is. So that's what I'd say. If you're going to order it, check where they're going to put the hole. I would be putting it roughly halfway up, because the basic rule of thumb is half pond, half soil. That's, it is the sort of standard for wicking beds. Pond is half of it, soil is half of it.
Regardless of the kind of height of the bed, like if you had an 800 high,
Oh, well, that's a little bit different.
theoretically.
So
Yeah, okay.
then you've got to figure out what you're going to do. See, a standard wicking bed, and the standard bed, in fact, is about 600. 600 high, which is, a metre minus 400. So I can't show it here with my arms, but that would be standard for a timber bed, and it's also standard for the galvanised.
And I have just one more question. When you get galvanised beds, should you put some water in and test out whether they leak, or will they always be sealed?
Oh, well, I'm a strong believer in, try before you, start to build something. I would test it. I would put water in and leave it overnight, at least. And then if it's
Priya,
not
have you another question?
Yep, I think Priya might have had one.
I just had a question about the height. Are the ones at the Macleod Garden 600 high? Is that how high they are?
So 3 sleepers. The sleepers are 200 millimetres high. So,
Okay.
yeah, standard
Okay.
height. It works. A good height for gardening, I think, too. Some people prefer the slightly high, which is fine, but that's pretty reasonable height.
Yeah.
Are there any more questions?
Well,
if not, Paul, I will thank you very much for the presentation, and we will finish 2 minutes early.
Right.
So have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Paul.
Yes, thanks so much. It was great.